Wasatiyya again falls into this onion model, dividing the deen up into essential versus non-essential. So Wasatiyya started with Muhammad Abdu, which we talked about in the 19th century. He was under the influence of the British. The British promoted him. They made him the Grand Mufti of Egypt. And he was a pure reformist. He denied jinn, for example. He denied creation of Adam. He accepted Darwinism. And so he started this kind of method of reform. So he said that, well, family law, ritual law, and general moral principles, those are thawabit. They don't change. They're constant over time, whether it's 1400 years ago or today. But then there's mutaghayyirat, and those are things like the khilafah, hudud, laws of governance, jihad, ban on riba, and the dhimmi rules, for example, among other things like commercial transaction law, etc. So that Wasatiyya was developed, started with Muhammad Abdu, then his student Rashid Rida, the main student of Abdu, developed this Wasati position. And if you listen to Yasir Qadhi in many lectures, he talks about Rashid Rida. He's, the scholar that I mainly follow. And Rashid Rida is the one who invents this moderate Islam. It's an onion, right? You get rid of these layers. You say that they're non-essential. We are in different times and places. We can adapt these things like leadership, political leadership, criminal law, financial law, anything related to war. We can adapt and change. But when it comes to family law, ritual rules, etc., then those are constant. So you can see some references there. Yusr al-Islam is the main book of Rashid Rida, where he lays out this kind of ideology. And so the British, and there's also Mustafa al-Maraghi, who became the Sheikh al-Azhar, promoted by the British because he also proposed this type of moderate Islam, which is reform Islam. And you can see that Yasir Qadhi is a subscriber of this. So this is a chart that one of Yasir Qadhi's students put out on Twitter a couple of years ago. I have retweeted it, obviously, a couple of different times. And this is what Yasir Qadhi teaches in his courses and his lectures. He's like, there's a spectrum here. There are the progressives on the far left. Then there's the modernists. Then on the far right, you have the traditional madhab followers, and then you have the Salafis. And then we're right in between. We're the middle nation. We're the middle path, wasat, between the two extremes. So the way that he glosses it is like, okay, on the left, you have the cultural leaning side. And on the right, you have the textual leaning. The strict adherence of the madhab and the tradition, those are the far right. And then you have the Salafis that are more moderate, but they're still on the right. Whereas the Wasati, you try to balance the text and the context. Have an interplay between the classical tradition and modernity. Respect the tradition, but you're not wed to it. The tradition isn't divine. Employ usul al-fiqh beyond the text in the real world. Care about the implications of fatwa and impact on the community. Because if you follow a madhab or you're a Salafi, you don't care about the impact on the community of fatwa. You're ignorant about, or you're careless about that impact. Ignore culture and context in clear matters like LGBT. So this is the thawabit. In certain clear-cut matters, you can ignore the culture and context. What about khilafah? That's not clear-cut. What about hudud? That's not clear-cut. What about different regulations in family matters? That's not clear-cut, which you're going to question in the interview that we're going to react to. Those are also clear-cut, but you prefer the cultural context. You prioritize the cultural context as opposed to what is clear-cut. So this is the arbitrary nature of this reform. So Wasati, it's coined by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi to describe Rashid Rida's approach, and it's adhered to by Sheikh Yasir Qadhi and others. So this is the precedent that Yasir Qadhi claims that, oh, this is not my new invention. This is something that previous scholars have said. Oh, which scholars are those? Oh, other modernist scholars, other reform scholars. Oh, okay. So these are the authorities that Yasir Qadhi name drops because a lot of Muslims, his listeners, like the person who took this class probably, might not know, well, who's Rashid Rida? Like, who is he? Like, oh, he must be like, Imam Abu Hanifa. Maybe he's like Imam Ghazali, like Rashid Rida. I don't know who that is. In reality, this is someone from just 150 years ago. This is someone modern, under the influence of British modernity. And he was pressured. He's the student of Abdu, like this arch reformist. You can barely call him a Muslim because he's rejecting clear-cut nusus of the Quran and Sunnah. And that's his main student is Rashid Rida. Now, we'll talk more about Rashid Rida, actually, because Yasir Qadhi misrepresents Rida. And we're going to talk about that, inshallah. But this is Wasatiyya. So let's define it. Wasatiyya says Sharia rules may be divided into two basic categories: Ibadat rules and Muamalat rules. Ibadat means like worship, rituals, and Muamalat are like interpersonal relations between people. This is how they divide it. And pre-modern scholars, actually, prior to the modern period, they do use this distinction of Ibadah versus Muamalat. So Ibadat refers to like Salah, fasting, Hajj. And Muamalat are things like family law, laws of marriage, divorce, inheritance, also any kind of commercial law, financial transactions, criminal law like hudud, ta'zir, dhimmi laws, anything like that. Those are all muamalat. So this is not something new. Wasatiyya didn't invent this. But Wasatiyya does modify and shift things. They include the family law like marriage, inheritance, divorce. They include it in ibadat. And then everything else is muamalat. So ibadat are thawabit. They cannot be changed. They are constant. They might be slightly adjusted or fine-tuned, but muamalat are the things that we mainly change. So this is different because family law like marriage law, divorce law, inheritance law, the traditional scholars consider that part of muamalat as well. But because the wasatis, they want to be able to change and amend and replace the muamalat, they consider the muamalat mutaghayyirat, changeable. They shift family law into ibadat because it's too extreme if we start attacking, if we start changing family law. Yeah, we can say that the dhimmi rules don't apply, you don't apply jizya, you don't actually apply the hudud. Yeah, that's fine, but inheritance, that can't be changed. Just like you can't change the 5 prayers, just like you can't change fasting Ramadan to fasting Shawwal. You can't change that. You can change all the other aspects of the Sharia though. That's changeable with time and place. Those are mutaghayyirat. So this is arbitrary. This is all arbitrary, as we'll see, what they think is changeable and what's not changeable. Wasatiyya claims muamalat are understood in terms of consequentialism. So maximizing happiness, maslaha. Maslaha means benefit. What's the benefit? What's the pros? As opposed to the mafsada or mafasid, like what are the harms? Pros versus cons. So you weigh pros and cons, what's going to be the best consequence in terms of maximizing happiness and reducing harm. The traditional Sharia rules were good for maximizing happiness in the 7th century in Arabia, but now liberal scientific rules are best for this in modern societies. Wasatiyya retains ritual and family rules, but replaces everything else with maslaha-based ijtihad. So everything else that's outside of the ibadat as we define them, rituals and family law, everything else we can change based on maslaha. Consequentialism. So this is completely something new. This is the modern reform deviance that justifies peeling so much of Islam, peeling that onion. Did Allah say, like in the Quran, that, oh, these rules you can never change, these ayat and these hadith, oh, these are optional, these are only for our time, these are only for 7th century Arabia. Everything else outside of ibadat and family law, those you can change depending on what's best for you at that time. Depending on your socio-cultural circumstances, those can be adapted. Did Allah say that? Do we find a hadith? Did the Prophet ﷺ say that? No. Spoiler alert, no. There's nowhere where that is said. Now, of course, they're going to try to justify these changes, as we'll see, by appealing to the Salaf and the Sahaba. And we're going to get into that in a second. So is this valid ijtihad? Reformers claim they're simply doing the same ijtihad that past scholars did. We're just doing ijtihad. Ijtihad is allowed. That's what traditional Islam says. We're just like the mujtahideen of the past. But is this true? So there's this term, maslaha mursala, which translates to public benefit. This term is very important because this is what the Wasatiyya use constantly, is maslaha mursala. It's basically weighing the pros and the cons. Maslaha mursala, you can translate as public good or public benefit. Some scholars historically in the tradition, they rejected completely maslaha mursala. Some accepted it in very limited circumstances where there's literally nothing in the Quran, the Sunnah, ijma' or qiyas that was applicable. So extremely limited. But what reformists do when they use maslaha mursala is a completely different thing, because they are actually using maslaha to negate actual rules of the Quran, actual rules and regulations of the Quran and Sunnah, things that have been agreed upon by ijma'. They will attack and reform those things on the basis of maslaha. What is the public benefit? We want to maximize happiness for the most number of people, so we have to weigh the pros and the cons, the good and the evil. We have to weigh that. That's maslaha and mafsada. And that's why we can reform these different policies, these different rules of the Sharia. That's perfectly acceptable because look, previous scholars had maslaha mursala when they were doing their ijtihad, so why can't we? But this is a lie. This is a distortion. Previous scholars, first of all, some scholars rejected the concept entirely. Some madhahib rejected the concept entirely. Others didn't reject it, but they said it's acceptable in very limited circumstances. In very limited circumstances. And we're going to look at some quotes on maslaha mursala in a second, inshallah. So every work of usul al-fiqh rejects this idea that you can just apply maslaha reasoning to things that the Quran and Sunnah already have legislated. You can't apply maslaha mursala to things that Allah has already said. Allah says, don't drink alcohol. Don't approach zina. You can't say, well, actually, the public benefit is that alcohol is a booming industry and brings a lot of profits, and now maybe there are certain medicines that can be used that take away drunkenness and actually take away the harms of alcohol, so we can now drink alcohol, no problem. That's maximizing our benefit, our happiness in society, so now alcohol is permitted. That's not allowed. That's not allowed, even though that you can make a maslaha argument, or you can make even a public benefit argument. That's not valid. You can make arguments about Friday prayer. Well, people go to work on Fridays. It's difficult. They have to leave work to go to the masjid in the middle of the workday. Let's move it to Saturdays. That's maslaha mursala. That's the public benefit. Why not? And actually, Yasir Qadhi has used this kind of reasoning because he argued that, well, we need to calculate the beginning of Ramadan and calculate Eid on the basis of calculations. Forget about moon sighting. We can use calculations. And the main argument that he uses, even though all scholars have rejected this historically, only modernists in the modern period have said that this is acceptable. All traditional scholars have rejected this. Yasir Qadhi's main argument is to say, well, it's inconvenient not to know the exact day of Eid, and you have a lot of communities that engage in moon wars, and this is a fitna. So this is not in the benefit of the community. We have to go to calculations. This is maslaha mursala. And this is not what the pre-modern scholars meant with maslaha mursala. They meant only in issues where the Quran and Sunnah have not legislated. In the issue of the beginning of the month and the end of the month, that has been legislated by the Quran. Allah says to sight the moon. So this is why every work, this reformist idea, is completely rejected in Islamic scholarship. So is this Wasatiyya Islamic? Advocates of the Wasatiyya position admit that they break with the pre-modern tradition to some extent, but they conceal the extent of this break in several ways. First, they pretend that pre-modern Islamic law was deeply concerned with general consequentialist moral principles, which are linked to notions of maslaha and maqasid sharia that are mentioned in usul al-fiqh texts. Traditionally, studying sharia is primarily about mastering specific legal rules associated with the madhahib, like Hanafi madhab, Shafi'i. These rules are seen as morally or less eternally valid. So the trick of the Wasatis is that they, because they want to reform all of these rules and regulations of the Sharia, they will prioritize maslahah-based reasoning. They will prioritize maqasid Sharia, when in reality, traditionally, the Sharia, studying the Sharia, meant learning in detail the specific rules in fiqh. That's why when you go and study Hanafi fiqh, or you want to be a real student of knowledge, you go and start with mutun that are just about the rules, like what kinds, starting with tahara, for example. What kind of water can you use to make wudu? That's what you start with. That's on day one. And then you progress into salah, siyam, etc. And then eventually you go to mu'amalat, marriage, divorce, then eventually oaths, eventually commercial transactions, buyu', eventually jihad, etc. That is learning the specific rulings. You don't even talk about maslahah. There's nothing there related to maslahah except when you get into usul al-fiqh, and that's later in your studies, and it's not on the basis of, oh, we're learning maslahah because we're going to derive new rules, or we're in a different socio-economic circumstance or socio-cultural landscape, so where we have to develop new rules based on maslahah or based on the maqasid sharia. So these concepts of maslahah and maqasid sharia, yeah, they're there. You'll find them in pre-modern works, but they're marginal. They're extremely marginal, and the modernists and the wasatis like Abdu and Rashid Rida and Yasir Qadhi, they will elevate this as if this is what the Sharia is all about. Learning the Sharia, knowing the Sharia is about knowing what is actually the maslahah, the masalih and the mafasid, and what are the maqasid. That's what the true scholars, as Yasir Qadhi will say, the true people of knowledge, the brave scholars, the deep researchers, as he puts it, they know that the Sharia is about maslahah and maqasid sharia. It's only the closed-minded, these madrasa students, these Salafis that are so stupid that they just think that the Sharia is based on memorizing a bunch of rules out of 1,000-year-old books. Like, they're closed-minded. They're not brave enough, like me, to question whether these rules are still applicable, or we can't fine-tune them. We have to fine-tune, as he says over and over again. We'll see. So this is a distortion of the pre-modern tradition. You're foregrounding something that historically was extremely marginal. And maslahah, maqasid sharia, they were not used in places where the nusus, where the Quran, the Sunnah, Ijma' and Qiyas have been applied and are relevant. You can't just say, you can't override all of that because, oh, this is a maslahah. Or, oh, the maqasid say, actually, forget about applying the had. Forget about chopping the hand. Forget about lashing the adulterer or the zani. We're going to actually look at the maslahah. No, this was never the case. This is only something modern. It's something reformist. Okay, I just said this. Yeah, so the scholars who gave the most attention to maslahah and maqasid sharia are marginal figures like Najm ad-Din al-Tufi and Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi. And admittedly, these figures are now quite famous. However, their ideas exerted almost no influence until the modern period, and Abdu and Rida promoted them. So these figures had no main prominence compared to other ulama of our tradition. They only became prominent and oft quoted, and their works have been studied in depth because of Abdu and because of Rashid Rida bringing them into prominence for the purposes of reform. Obviously, these scholars themselves are not reformists. These are pre-modern scholars. They're not reformists, but they talk about maslahah and maqasid sharia, and they theorize it to a certain extent. But let's be honest, these are marginal figures. They were not given this kind of high status as Shaykh al-Islam or some groundbreaking scholar. They only got this status because of the reformists using their ideas for the purposes of reform. And it's really a bastardization of their ideas because these scholars would reject the reformist, obviously. Proponents of Wasatiyya claim that their approach is supported by the actions of the Salaf. Is this true? So these are the main arguments, because when we say that, well, what you're calling for is not found in the Quran and Sunnah when you're dividing ibadat and mu'amalat, and you're saying certain things are essential, other things are non-essential. This is not in the Quran and Sunnah. Where are you getting this from? They say, let's look at what the Sahaba did. That shows us that our approach is justified. And it's actually completely in line with the Sharia. And you're ignorant and you're a neophyte. And they'll point to these examples. These are their go-to. Yasir Qadhi didn't invent this. Like, Hatem al-Hajj didn't invent this. This is what Abdu and Rida and these reformists 200 years ago, they came up with as examples. And people like Yasir Qadhi just regurgitate the same nonsense 200 years later.